You're listening to Raincoast Radio.
Welcome to Raincoast Radio's first series of Wolves and Women. I'm Chelsea Greer, Director of Raincoast Wolf Conservation Program, and your host for this series of conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. Today, I am excited to be joined by international lawyer and natural resource ecologist, Susan Bragdon. Welcome, Susan. It's so good to have you here for this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Could you introduce yourself to our audience and listeners?
Yeah, so I'm Susan Bragdon. I'm based here in Portland, Oregon in the US, and I run a small not-for-profit called Seeds for All, really focused on policy, mostly international, but also national, that affects what small-scale farmers grow and trying to support agrobiodiversity and nutrient-dense diets and having a sustainable agriculture that is promoting social issues, equity issues, and economic and environmental issues. So basically, sustainability appropriate for the cultures in which these populations of farmers are living.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited to dive into your current work a little bit later on in the podcast. But I think for this podcast, we want to start way at the beginning. At a very young age, when you started working with wolves, I believe you were 13. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about what led you there?
Yeah, it's funny. As a child, I think I had a sense of, I had justice issues probably coming out of the womb. I don't know why, but I do remember being read Little Red Riding Hood and being actually outraged at how the wolf was portrayed and thinking it wasn't fair. I was born in Manhattan and for some reason always wanted a dog. And my parents said it's, not a good place to have a dog. And when I was 10, we moved to Oregon, and the way they enticed me, not that I had any choice, was to say I could have a dog. So I'd always had a really keen interest in dogs as well. And so when we moved to Oregon, we adopted a mutt, and he was my best friend growing up, one of my best friends. And I guess I was, again, my interest in wolves. I had David Nietzsche's book by my bedside from the time it was published in the 70s. That was like a Bible to me, was David Nietzsche's book.
Which book was that?
I think it was his first one. So it was probably of Wolves in the World. It was the first book I think he published. It's so long ago now, I can't actually remember the title. But, he was the sort of renowned expert at the time. And yes, I was just interested in wolf behavior. And so I wrote the director of the Oregon Zoo. It was called the Washington Park Zoo at the time. I guess I didn't realize there was, it might be odd for a 13-year-old girl to write to the director of a zoo. It just never occurred to me. So I just said I was very interested in studying wolves, and would that be possible? And so I was very fortunate to have someone like Warren Iliff, who was the head of the zoo at the time. He said, "Sure, why don't you get in touch with Paul Packett, who's doing research for Portland State University." So again, very fortunate, reached out to Paul, and he said, "Yeah, that'd be great. Why don't you come? I'm doing this research. I could use a research assistant." And that's how it began at age 13.
Wow. And do you think there's anything from your childhood in terms of growing up? I know your mother was a professional, pretty influential. And you talk about not even really thinking about how it never crossed your mind, reaching out as a young girl wouldn't be something that you should do. Was there anything kind of growing up that you think kind of created that confidence in you?
That's a good question, because in so many ways, I don't think I was confident, more that I was passionate. So I was passionate about these animals and about learning about them and wanting to be engaged in some way. And of course, as a kid, you're not going out into the field. So you look for the opportunities to do it. Certainly, both my parents would never have discouraged me from, they would have encouraged me to follow my passions. So in that sense, my parents were quite supportive of me reaching out. They wouldn't have tried to stop it, though. I think both my parents are no longer with us. I think they would tell you it was a surprise to them, that my interests were my own, that they learned from me about and generated interest in wolves, because that's what I was interested in. But yeah, so I don't think it came from them so much as they were, supportive of all their children's following things that were of interest to them. And again, I think I was just very fortunate to be in an environment where I found two receptive people to a 13-year-old, as opposed to dismissive, because it'd be so easy to dismiss, like, well, you're 13, what do you know? How could you possibly contribute or have anything of value to add to this research? And that is not what I got a very receptive response from both these people. So yeah, I feel very fortunate about that, because it could absolutely have been very different. I could have just been turned away and that didn't happen. So I was lucky.
And so one of those people was Paul Paquette. And so what was your experience working with him as a researcher, and your first initial interactions, and like what he was focusing on at the zoo and kind of what your role at the zoo was?
Both Paul and I have talked about this sort of looking backwards, and he would say, well, I never really saw you as a teenager. And I think we're similar in our passion, our curiosity. And again, Paul was just always very respectful of, that value and input and insight could come from anywhere. And so I never felt like he was treating me like, differently than if I'd been a PhD candidate working for him, or, he just treated me as an equal, even though obviously my education, my experience, my educational level was completely below his. But yeah, I think Paul is just the type of human being who is open, curious, and sees that value can come from unexpected places. And so he was open to what I might or might not contribute in the research. And I think, again, we shared a passion for the pack and for the animals. And I think that also was something that and for dogs, he had 3 dogs, I had my, so yeah, I think it was shared passion and shared curiosity and maybe shared openness. And again, feeling very lucky that someone, at his stage of his career would welcome a 13-year-old girl. Again, I just kind of look back like, that's kind of mind blowing that he would do that. So I'm always grateful to him for that.
Yeah, it seems like your steps to reach out to the zoo, obviously was demonstrated your passion and curiosity. And it seems like, from my experience with Paul too, like I said this in a past conversation, it's like he kind of makes you feel like you can do anything. And I think it's just recognizing how important the curiosity and the passion really is. And then everything else is to follow, essentially. Like those are the key things that you need to have, I think, in any career, especially when you're talking about, researching animals, working with animals and people. There can be some really amazing special moments that keep the passion alive, but there can also be really difficult things that you have to deal with. So I think it's important to have that passion throughout.
Right. No, I think that's right. And yeah, I think those qualities of being open to whatever you find, and trying as much as possible to be open and try to recognize, am I bringing something into this equation, into this situation of which I'm unaware, that might keep me less open. I may not be open. And that actually relates back to being curious, not just curious about what you're observing, curious about this pack of wolves you're observing, but also curious about yourself. Like, what am I bringing to this? And trying to keep open to that sort of internal dialogue as well. But yeah, shared passion also, I think, is really important. And, it's funny with I'm in the United States, so I'm still reeling from this election where you had one candidate talking about joy. So I almost hesitate to use the word, but there was real joy in being, part of the research team with Paul, spending time with the wolf pack. It was not at all a mechanical exercise of marking down, this is what, this behavior here. It wasn't a mechanical exercise, even though there's mechanics to it and has to be in order to be able to do your, analysis and all that sort of thing. But I think, again, probably getting back to sort of another thing that, I think Paul and I share, and I'm sure it's true in your work as well, is not just the passion, but there's also joy in it. Really looking forward to seeing our pack, and seeing them every day. And that's incredibly special.
Yeah, I would agree with the joy. And also I find working with people that are also super passionate, there's joy in like getting together. With Raincoast, we all essentially work remote, but we try and get together as much as possible. And there's so much joy coming together with team members that are equally as passionate about things as you are.
Yeah, because it's not everyone, I couldn't have explained to my probably peer group at the time why I thought it was fun to sit in the freezing cold with my feet going numb, watching these wolves interact with one another, that they became like another family to me. Like I was, even though obviously I'm not part of that family, but you do feel part of it somehow. Maybe you just feel connected to it. And it's nice not to have to explain that. I don't have to explain it to you. I wouldn't have to explain it to Paul. And there are people that you would explain it. They would just look at you like you're crazy. Like, it's fun for you to sit there in the rain. Is it fun? Yes, actually it is.
It creates memories, that's for sure. And so your role, so you talk about watching a particular pack. Can you kind of describe for listeners what that entailed?
Yeah, well, that we had a certain, place that we would sit looking over an enclosure. I mean, it's a captive pack. And at that time, enclosures were so much worse than they are today. And I still think we have a long way to go dealing with captive animals. But so, yeah, we sat in a certain place. We had a thing called an ethogram, which is a catalog of behaviors that a species typically exhibit, and then a systematic way to record that behavior. I didn't remember this until Paul reminded me. I also just took extensive notes, So some of it's just like, there's social behaviors, dominance behaviors, predatory behaviors. In a captivity, that looks different than it obviously would in the wild. There's resting behaviors. And all those sorts of interactions can be cataloged, and you put down the time, the weather, the animals that are involved. So, and then like if you have a chin rest, it's like, okay, that's a dominance behavior. Who put their chin on top of the back of that well, and sometimes things can be both social dominance and related to food. So you have your ears to the side, kind of like airplanes. So that indicates tension, but you don't know, is this dominance? Is this? So each one of these behaviors is cataloged and you have initials that you use. And so you're recording behavior that way. And then also I would take qualitative notes of what I was seeing, just because that's the way I am.
And so important. I mean, that makes me think of, and I was going to ask a question related to this because I know that there was a lot of people that visited the zoo that you were working at, and one of them was Jane Goodall. And I mean, just describing like how you're taking notes and how important the qualitative stuff is too, because it's also has part of your interpretation of what's happening, but also provides the context. Because you said there's so many ways that an ear position can be interpreted, and the context is so important. But was Jane Goodall, was her work really inspirational to you, kind of getting into the behavioral side of things?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, again, same thing as being younger before we even moved to Oregon. And she got involved with the chimps at our zoo once I'd gone to college. But she's an amazing human being. But her work prior to her being involved with the Oregon Zoo was absolutely inspirational, because she was able to, I think, be rigorous and scientific, but also to see the personalities of these chimpanzees. And it's the same in a wolf pack. These are complex social structures that she observed, that we observe in wolves, that we were observing in this captive pack. She could see individuals, their personalities, the role their personalities play. Same thing in a wolf pack. Each wolf has its own individual personality, it even has its own distinct voice. And as you watch a troop of chimpanzees or you watch a wolf pack, you can't not get to know their personalities. And that has an influence. They're shyer animals, and just like human beings, we have personalities, and you get to know them. And what I loved about Jane Goodall's work is that she was able to both be a scientist, but to bring this social science in as well, and to recognize individuals matter, personality matters. That's part of the whole dynamic. And if you care about the animals, you care about their survival, you're going to have to look at all sorts of levels. And one of those is the individual. And so, yeah, I thought she was groundbreaking in that way. And she certainly received a lot of criticism in the beginning for her approach. So I really appreciated that she persevered. And look at her today. She continues to be a pioneer and a leader in all of this, conservation, and also just just the problems facing the world and how they fit together. So again, sort of, I think chimpanzees for her, it was an entry point into a larger world. And I think if I look at sort of my career, this wolves, and I've been working with the chimps as well at our zoo, it's really an entry point, and you start seeing connections to lots of things. And I think Dr. Goodall is a really good example of someone who does exactly that, including human beings.
Yeah, because it's kind of taking, looking at different ways that we can look and understand these animals, and almost considering their perspective and really their senses and how they perceive the world and their personalities, all of these things combine. Like, we need to understand, we can't just understand one thing, and them displaying one specific behavior and not accounting for all these other things kind of limits our understanding of them in a lot of ways. Studying personality, I mean, has major conservation implications as well. Like, I always think of stories that people have told me of pack members that led the pack within the territory and being killed on highways, and then a new pack member coming in, and that particular individual not being willing to, cross a corridor, or just the individual choices that wolf makes has major implications for like accessibility to different habitats. And it has all of these important implications, I guess, not just for those individuals, but when we look at conservation more broadly too. So this is kind of the start, when we look back at what Jane Goodall did and what you and Paul were doing in captivity as well with wolves. It's kind of building that foundation.
Yeah. Just the example of a wolf being killed and then the pack learning from that, and not the next leader perhaps not crossing a corridor. So that's a learned behavior that the pack adopts, right? And that's something that says you're learning something about the leadership, the new leadership of that pack, that there was something learned, and it changed and shifts the direction of the pack. And that's where I think this interaction of sort of individual with ecosystem and needing to look at it all the different levels, and not saying, oh, we are going to exclusively look at it this level or exclusively at that level, even though we can understand there might be tension, but that we do have to understand all those aspects, especially when you think about sort of reintroducing wolves. Well, I would kind of want to know the personality of the wolf or the pack and the leader of the pack before I introduce it into a particular environment, because I think that would have an effect on its success.
Yeah, definitely. There's been work on, actually think about one of my graduate supervisors doing work on kangaroo rats, where she looked at the personalities of these animals being reintroduced and things like curiosity and level of risk they're willing to take. Like, all of those are really important traits to look at when you're choosing individuals to reintroduce into an area. Because if they're really shy and they're not willing to take risk, like, perhaps there's the success rate of them actually surviving in the wild is going to be a lot lower.
Right. Yeah. It's not to say that we don't think there can be learning and changing within an individual, but there, as we're saying, there are personalities and more risk averse, more risk taking. And again, doesn't mean that's immutable, can't change. But if you're having small opportunities of reintroduction, or you want to maximize their chances of success, and that's got to include the personality of an individual and that impact of that on the pack.
Okay, well, I've heard this story from Paul Paquette and also from one of the Yellowstone Wolf Watchers, Rick McIntyre, who has referenced this story when talking about his book on alpha female wolves. And I'll preface this by saying, when you were working as Paul's research assistant, it was generally accepted that it was male wolves who were pack leaders. But during your observations, you made the perhaps unintentional, but I would say revolutionary discovery that it was actually female wolves who are in charge. So could you tell us about how that came about? I'd really love to hear your version of the story.
I always wonder, maybe it was actually a benefit to be 13 and naive, because you mark down what you're seeing, and it didn't occur to me that what I was seeing and recording, and then obviously giving my data to Paul, was at all revolutionary. It was just what I was seeing and recording. And, at the time there weren't all that many women in the wolf world, but the idea was that males are alpha, they lead the pack, they're the ones that direct all the behavior. And that's not at all what my data showed. And it's not what I qualitatively saw. And some of that it truly is qualitative. It's, you don't necessarily have the ethogram letters that you need to put by it. But even those ethogram letters bore it out. But you could just tell that everybody kind of looked towards Juno, who was the alpha female. And that's also flipped during my time studying them. But that's what I saw. And so I've probably been working there about a month, I think, I think I gave my data. This is so long ago. I don't remember the intervals, but whether it was every couple of weeks or a month. And I know this after talking to Paul after the fact. He didn't tell me at the time. He was like, "Oh no, what have I done? This girl really doesn't know what she's doing." And So then my understanding is he actually, without telling me, did observations from another spot at the same time I was doing it and realized that my data was correct. And again, to his credit, he didn't take credit for it. I mean, he was the lead researcher. He could have said, look what I found. But I learned this because a 13-year-old girl started to work with me. And so again, I really appreciate Paul. And it's not even weird for a lead researcher to take credit for data. That's not weird. I mean, that's done all the time. But I think it also probably was important to him to expose the bias. And you can only kind of do that by saying it was a girl, not a woman, a girl, that saw it. So, yeah, so I wasn't thinking much about it. I was just recording what I saw.
Yeah. And that's definitely a good example of like all the biases that as we get older kind of infiltrate into our lives. And then even especially in university and you're learning, no matter what program you're in, there are kind of certain biases that are coming in and certain perspectives. So yeah, just to have someone that was really novel to observational data and studying wolves. Yeah, it's a great example.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of bringing someone naive into an environment that's actually receptive, open, passionate, and curious, right? That it was a very good combination, I think, of factors. And I think we talked before, I said, and I was in my biology class, I was either a sophomore or junior, and we were writing different papers. You could pick a topic, and I was critiquing this paper on wolf communication, and I thought it was wrong. And so I said why I thought it was wrong and what I had observed. And I got a D on the paper, and my teacher wrote on it, "Who are you to fly in the face of authority?" And it's like, I'm glad that happened after I'd reached out to the zoo and was doing this work, because I could easily try to, shut a young person down. But for me, it didn't, because of people like Paul. I could say, I just got a D on this paper, because she gave me the opportunity to rewrite it. And I said, but I don't think I'm wrong. So I took the D.
Good for you. Yeah, it's definitely a good example of those like formative experiences, like you said. And yeah, to have that confidence to be like, no, this is exactly what I think. And I mean, it could be right, it could be wrong, but like, I'm going to stand with my opinion, and I'm not just going to change it because you say I should change it.
Yeah. And again, you need to be open that your opinion's wrong. But she wasn't telling me my opinion was wrong. She was saying I was flying in the face of authority. I said, well, what's wrong with that? I mean, it's like, I'm doing it politely, and I'm doing it with facts and my observations. So I'm not sure what's the problem with flying in the face of authority. But again, I think I'm lucky that I had the support of someone like Paul, because that might have shaken me up more than it did.
And so in, the 70s and 80s, there were very few women studying wolves, like you said, let alone young girls. What were some of the biggest challenges or obstacles that you faced as a young woman working in wildlife sciences at that time?
I mean, I think they're just obstacles that women face all the time. And sometimes, we may not even be aware of them. They can be subtle or not too subtle. I think I was lucky because the people that I worked with, David McDonald, Eric Pugliani, were people that Paul introduced me to, so that I think I was, moving into and working with people who were receptive to having women and valued the position, to having more women in the field. And I worked with Jenny Ryan at Dalhousie University. So another pioneer, a woman from the early days who was studying wolves. So, I think I was lucky. I don't know. I can speak to the broader community in terms of, because I think I was lucky again in terms of the doors that were opened to me, and they were open to people I think who would be receptive to having my perspective and a woman's perspective. But I think we face biases all the time. I mean, professionally, like I was a lawyer with the Convention on Biological Diversity. I was constantly being asked to get the coffee. And I have no doubt I was the only woman in the room, or I'd be one of two. And that there's a reason that I was young and female, and I was asked to get the coffee. So yeah, I'm very aware of I think the problems women face, and I'm particularly concerned about it with this past election. But I think I really was lucky in terms of the individuals I worked with. So, because I do think there's just systemic problems with how women are treated in most professions. I think because of the individuals I worked with, I was protected somewhat from some of those systemic problems, at least in this field, in wildlife conservation, for sure.
Right. And you mentioned Jenny Ryan in Nova Scotia. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you did with her?
Yeah, so Dalhousie has a captive pack that's in a provincial park, probably 45 minutes. It's Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, so not far from Halifax. And so they've been studying that pack for a long time, since the 70s. And so yeah, I was collecting data, and we did some work on scent rubbing with wolves. Again, there were 2 litters that were birthed that year, and one of the females started killing the pups from the other litter. So they ended up pulling a couple of those pups out. So I raised those pups. I actually never followed through that, but they were supposed to be used in howling studies. So I had a great time raising puppies, and then also just doing things like pulling. They were all fed roadkill from the provincial park, so pulling in roadkill for the pack. And so it was both data collection of a pack that didn't interact with people and raising these pups.
What was it like to raise wolf pups?
Ugh, yeah, that was magical. That was really magical. Tiring, just like, if you're a young mother and you have to wake up and feed a baby all the time, it's the same thing. You have to. So I actually they came in at night into the bathroom so that I could just roll into the bathroom and feed them. But yeah, it was really fun. And you start to see sort of where dogs and wolves differ. Not only, dogs and wolves can differ because their personalities, that the individuals are different, but also the wolves and dogs differ. You can see how domestication has affected dogs in a way it hasn't affected wolves. And again, Jenny was just also very supportive of having a young person in the field. And I think also really wanted to be encouraging of more women going into the field. I'm sure she had a sense of loneliness, so I don't want to put words in her mouth.
Yeah, you crave that connection with people that you relate to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I don't know if this would have been before your time with Jenny, but when you were 17, you presented a paper at a conference in 1978. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience, especially from the perspective of a young woman in a very male-dominated field?
Yeah, it was really fun. I guess it was the first sort of international wolf symposium, and it was held here in Portland, again, thanks to Paul and a lot of his colleagues from around the world who pulled together the funds to make the conference happen. So there were papers from wild, from captive. We had David Meach there, Durwood Allen, people that were my heroes. And so presenting papers on all sorts of topics from wild to captive behavior. And yeah, so Paul and I had written a paper together that was on simultaneous rearing of litters, because we had 2 of our female wolves had litters at the same time, and they took care of them together, nursed them together. And so there was a paper on that. And then I presented a paper, and I actually had forgotten this until Paul mentioned it. And especially because I ended up sort of moving into a legal field. I looked at the legal structures for protecting wolves, looking at the Endangered Species Act and other legislation, and how that made wolf conservation difficult. And yeah, so I presented it there. I can remember being incredibly nervous because it was standing up in front of all these people who I held in such high regard. I was just remember being very, very nervous, but it was great fun. And again, being able to hang out with these people, also trying to figure out when they all would go to a place that needed identification that I didn't have. How can I go in there too? Somehow we managed. Again, I think I've just been fortunate in, having people who are open to hearing from someone of a different gender, though there were, again, Jenny was there. There were, I think, probably 2 women.
Was Jane Packard there?
Yes, I think she was there too. Yeah. I think those were the 2 women and me. I'm pretty sure that might have been it. But yeah, again, it was a great group of researchers, and I never felt at all uncomfortable I'm uncomfortable as in nervous. I definitely felt that. And also just because they were really, a lot of these people were heroes to me. And so the little hero worship going on. So it was fun to get to meet people and, as just people. But yeah, just a nice group of people that were very, very supportive. So felt very lucky. I keep using the word luck a lot here.
But you think when you're in a room with, these people are likely successful for a variety of reasons, but being passionate and curious, you'd think that they would be super excited to see a young person so curious and passionate about what they are. Like you're sharing the same passion for the same animal, the same issues. So
yeah, maybe that just levels everything else out, because I don't think it had to be that way. One could envision, what are you doing? What are you doing this? I know this better than you. But maybe it is the passion, the curiosity, and seeing that coming from any corner is just something that is to be embraced, and that's how I experienced the people at the conference is embracing.
And in the places that you worked with wolves, do you have any stories of individual wolves that stood out to you or taught you something really important that kind of sticks with you?
Well, it's funny, probably mostly from here in at the Oregon Zoo, was just how things can change quickly, I guess. Because I guess when I was watching the pack in the beginning, it was, we had two individuals, Juno and Zane, who were the alpha individuals. And to me, that just seemed, that's the way it is. That's the way this group works. And, it's almost like this is my family. This is how my family interacts. And this is also my family. This is how my family interacts with one another. And overnight, that's changed. I came in, one day, and Mowgli, which was a male, he had part of his ear was gone. And Sitka was the female, and she was in charge. And I remember realizing, wow, I just had become sort of complacent in this dynamic, and sort of recognizing things can change very quickly. And also that your position in a hierarchy does affect how you express your personality. When Sitka was being checked, she behaved differently than when she was the one who was in charge. And so I just saw different aspects of her personality, and made me realize, oh, I've been making a lot of assumptions here about who these animals are and how they interact with one another. And there's more there than I was aware of. So just sort of recognizing change, and that things are dynamic, and that we need, again, to stay open to that. And at the same time, they were still the same individuals. Not like I didn't feel like I knew, oh, who is this? But it brought out different aspects of her personality. So yeah, I think it taught me the lesson of just the change is part of life, and to be open and curious, and to be paying attention, and to expect that there'll be change. Don't be surprised by it. Just be open to it, I guess. I hadn't realized that I had sort of beliefs about this pack that were like almost like, well, this is immutable. It doesn't change. And I think intellectually I knew, of course, it does, because I've read enough to know it does. But this was my pack. This was my Juno. I mean, so I realized how much I was projecting sort of my own self into it.
Yeah, and I feel like as humans, we really like the static, rigid structure and labels. Like it's just, sometimes we want things to be black and white. And with wolves, you really have to recognize that they're very dynamic. We've had lots of conversations about certain labels like alpha, dominant.
Yes, right.
All these reasons why you might maybe not want to use those. They might be accurate. They might accurately reflect a certain pack. But I remember Paul saying he doesn't like to use them because they kind of put wolves into this box, and they don't express how dynamic the pack structure is.
I think that's 100% true. And and again, maybe that's another important lesson learned. It's like, okay, use labels, alpha female, alpha male, leader, and it was a much more fluid and dynamic situation than that. And by using those labels, it become more black and white, and this is the way it is, as opposed to, actually, it's quite dynamic. And labels can maybe keep you from seeing the dynamic nature of these interactions. And I'm uncomfortable with the labels myself, but I don't know what the alternatives are. And maybe they've developed in the wolf world since I have not been active in it, but they always do kind of make me a little uncomfortable. And I think the fact that things can change that fast just shows that labels can be a hindrance to seeing dynamism.
And maybe just understanding that there's not a rigid definition. Like I think about Rick McIntyre's work on when he's talking about these stories of female wolves. And even Paul has shared this too, where you have particular alpha females or males that you could have a really dominant alpha female, or a really aggressive one, like Rick talks about in one of his books about, there's the alpha female 06 who was just very cooperative, and I don't want to say nonviolent, but just, caring, cooperative. And then you had a neighboring pack that was led by an alpha female that was very violent, and how that type of personality too can develop different cultures within those packs. And then Paul even saying you just had particular wolves that kind of just demanded respect and didn't really appear to have to put other wolves in line. It was just kind of demanded respect.
That's such a perfect example of Rick's work showing that, right? Because I would say that it's exactly the same with when I was saying, well, their personalities do get expressed differently as the hierarchy changed. But the fact is, it was very similar. Juno was a gentle leader. She was a gentle leader. She did not have to assert herself all the time, or maybe just that her personality wasn't such to do so. Whereas Sitka, she was a much more aggressive leader, and she asserted herself frequently. Those personality traits, I'm sure, existed, but when she just had got the freedom to express it when the hierarchy changed. And yeah, they're just as each individual wolf is an individual wolf, just like we're an individual human being. What I think is interesting about Rick's and others' works is like, well, what does that mean in terms of how these wolves relate to an ecosystem, how these wolves relate to environmental or other stressors, right? Because we're having more environmental and other stressors that are facing these, not just wolves, I mean, all sorts of different animals. But what does it mean when you have this personality and responding to environmental stresses versus this kind of personality? It's fascinating work. Yeah, I think Rick and his work has just been fascinating.
And so after the wolves, what was next for you? And did your work with wolves inspire the direction you took in your career?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think in the sense that, I mean, I was saying the same thing I mean, not to compare myself to Jane Goodall, who's a giant, but, I think chimpanzees were an entry point for her. And of course, she was the intellectual leader in that work. But I think in my tiny little way, this was an entry point into my career. And some of that, again, is I think I think there are always these connections. And as we move through life, if you see them, then you move with them if you're curious about it. And I think also, at the time I was thinking I was going to be a scientist, I think my belief at the time was you had to sort of pick between being an advocate and a scientist. And I think that's a false choice. In thinking if I really wanted to be an advocate, and that's what I started to believe where I wanted to go, my sort of compromise was I should bring science in there, but also work to get the experience of what it means to be an advocate for law and policies that are supportive of these things that I think are really important. And so, I spent a year on a Watson Fellowship. And so that's when I was working with David McDonald and with Eric Pugliani, again, people who were just welcomed me in to observe and to help them support their research. I think during that time, being up in the Arctic, being, out at night overnight, that I thought, I think I want to go to law school. So I went back to school and got a master's in resource ecology and a law degree, and thought what I wanted to do was try to use science and law for the conservation of biological diversity. And so ended up making a switch into working for I joined the United Nations Environment Program. They were starting to negotiate a treaty on conserving biological diversity. And they were looking for someone with a legal background that was both science and law. And at that time, it was far less common than it is. I think today there are a lot of programs that allow that kind of cross-fertilization and important synergies. But at the time, that requirement was harder to find candidates for, I think, at that time. So I started working in multilateral negotiations, which was a big switch.
Yeah. Can you tell us a bit about your work with the United Nations?
Yeah. So the United Nations has headquarters in different places for different subjects. So like the food and interest in food is all in Rome. You have Food and Agriculture Organization there, and UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, is based in Nairobi. But decisions usually come from the Secretary General in New York to authorize negotiations, or they come from the governing body of these different agencies that often then go and get approval from the Secretary General or from the General Assembly. So UNEP was tasked with negotiating a treaty on conserving biological diversity, and this act, surprisingly, was pushed by the United States, and they were focusing on conservation. At the same time, the Secretary General gave a mandate and brought in, now I'm going to forget his name, but I had the negotiations for the climate change treaty went out of New York. So there already was kind of a hierarchy and agency doing biodiversity and the New York headquarters for the climate change treaty. But so the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United States wanted to look, there were all these treaties. There's a wetlands treaty called the Ramsar Convention, there's migratory species, and they just thought it was too fragmented and they wanted an umbrella treaty. But that lasted about a nanosecond because developing countries housed a lot of this wild, and again, it was also focused on wild biodiversity, even though the mandate was for all biological diversity, including agricultural biodiversity. But they were all ministers of environment that negotiated it, so their focus was really on wild biodiversity. And there's a huge global inequity, and in climate change, that we were constantly affected by what happened in the climate change negotiations, where developing countries didn't have as much leverage, or they didn't feel they had as much leverage. But here, they had leverage. They were the hot spots for biological diversity. developing countries really wanted to find a way to use the resources they housed to create more equity globally. And so they negotiated for a mechanism called access and benefit sharing. If you want our resources, you're going to have some sort of contractual arrangement with us where benefits flow back to us. And this was based on things like, rosy periwinkle being found in Madagascar. Indigenous knowledge led companies to see that had medicinal qualities. It was then taken, developed, and used for leukemia treatments, and nothing flowed back to Madagascar or the populations that had been conserving that resource. So there were tons of examples like that. So the idea was to rectify that. It hasn't worked.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask. Because I would imagine a big worry is overexploitation of that resource as well.
Well, it's also just technology. I mean, this is genetic information. It's digitized. How many times do you need access to it? So there are lots of problems. And you don't know that when you're negotiating something. Problems come out in the implementation of it. And I think whenever there are kind of the power disparities that just exist between countries, and also increasingly just commercial interests, which are either indirectly or directly influencing government positions in these negotiations. And then there was the whole thing was like, they're not thinking at all about how different agricultural biodiversity is. That it does, agricultural biodiversity has been moving around since, the Columbian Exchange. So if the benefits are supposed to go to the country of origin of genetic resources, which is defined in the treaty as where it got its distinctive properties, for agricultural biodiversity, how do you find a country of origin? The pedigree from a particular crop could be 6 feet long. And so it just was never going to work. And also, the good that's sort of applied is the actual exchange of these resources. That, if you want to have robust food systems, you want to be able to exchange plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, for breeding. And that's how all these crops that didn't exist in other places, all during the Columbian Exchange, we became mutually interdependent. So where did a potato get its center of origin? Maybe in Peru, Bolivia, in the Andes, and you may have maize is from Mexico. But if it's been traveling around the world, what's the country of origin? Because it now has distinctive properties in Africa or different countries of Africa. And so it just was never going to work. We're never going to have bilateral access and benefits sharing arrangements around agricultural biological diversity. And it actually didn't really work around wild biological diversity either. But for the agrobiodiversity, there was at some point people started to recognize, ooh, this is not going to work. And so people who were working in the field of agricultural development and food and nutrition security, we got engaged. And the Food and Agriculture Organization got a mandate to negotiate a treaty that looked specifically at plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, and to set up a governance system for that would be compatible with the Convention on Biological Diversity and the goals of that treaty, but would have a different mechanism to see that the benefits flowed.
Okay, so your work with United Nations, you really, I guess, identified this gap and this need for these treaties around agroecology and agrobiodiversity. And so did that really lead to founding the organization that you direct now, Seeds for All?
Yes, and I'm not the one that recognized this gap. There were people long in the field. That was not my field. It was more, again, it's sort of saying, oh, there's a connection here, and you sort of follow it. I always think my work has always just evolved based on what I've experienced and learned. And part of it was sort of living in Kenya. There's poverty everywhere. And I think you see it even more starkly now in the United States with homelessness but I was largely sheltered from a lot of that, which doesn't mean poverty didn't exist when I was a kid in the United States. But I don't think it was as visible as it is now. But living in Kenya, the scale of poverty, the scale of hunger, there was no escaping it. So I cared about elephants and wildlife, but I used to for me, it was like, I can't care about these things if I don't actually care about food and nutrition security. And then it was actually being educated by others. Well, what underpins food and nutrition security? Agrobiodiversity. And then, this treaty doesn't do that well. And I was actually representing the Convention on Biological Diversity at the Food and Agriculture Organization, where I heard a man named Jeff Houghton, he was the Director General of the International Plant Genetic Resources Institute. He gave a talk, and I found him so compelling about, if we don't change how we're dealing with agricultural biodiversity, we are really headed in an irreversible path. And so I introduced myself, a job opened up there. Again, it was a scientific organization. So I was the sort of first lawyer that was brought in to sort of lead the input of this institution to those negotiations for agricultural biodiversity, and also trying to make sure that we were continuing to connect with the Convention on Biological Diversity, because these things had to be compatible. And so since I had knowledge of one, it was a good place to be. But yeah, I feel I learned those things because it wasn't the perspective that I came from. But I did have a science background. Genetics wasn't a mystery to me, though. The way genetics has gone now, it's kind of mysterious to me now again. But yeah, again, just sort of being open to the need and a gap, I think, and feeling like, well, I could add something here. I do understand this treaty and what motivated the Convention on Biological Diversity, and really understanding, again, if you want to conserve elephants, you better get this food and nutrition security stuff down. You better figure it out. And so, yeah, that sort of, I think, is what drove me to want to make that leap, which actually, if you'd asked me that when I was younger, I would have said, oh, no, I would never, not that these are plants.
I definitely resonate with that, because I feel like in my younger years, trying to figure out what I wanted to do and really honing in on wildlife and just non-human animals in general. And I'm kind of making that comment, like, I like animals more than humans. And then as you get more exposed to like the complexities of, wildlife conservation, you realize that it's very much a human issue, and you cannot conserve wildlife without engaging different communities and really like recognizing and informing yourself about what different human communities face and what that means for conservation. And especially when it comes to food security, it's such a basic human necessity. And you can't expect communities to even be able to be concerned with conserving wildlife when they can't even feed themselves. So it's really like a foundational need, and it's all so linked together.
Right. And I think that's exactly it. It's like, it's being open to the interconnections that you may not have known exist. If you just be open to it and then follow it. If it interests you and you think you can, great. If you don't, maybe that's not the direction you want to go, but just being open to it. I mean, that's what makes it also fun, because you're always learning and you're being curious about it. It's like, oh, I didn't know this. Being able to admit, I didn't know this, and I need to understand this, and feeling like, can I do anything that would help contribute to this? And also just wanting to learn and say, wow, this is a fascinating area of study. And I do think the importance of interconnection and sort of, yeah, it almost gets back to what we were talking about, like the interconnections between humans and non-human species. And this is the interconnection between people who are conservationists or people who are worried about production, or that all these things, if we don't think of them in a kind of holistic way, and how do they relate, that it's going to be hard to address the problems that we face.
Yeah. And really, I mean, a lot of your work too focuses on small scale farmers, working with local communities. And that's really, we can't come up with solutions without involving the communities that our practices impact. And could you talk a little bit about how working with those communities and learning from traditional knowledge has informed the work that you do?
Yeah, again, it's something I feel like I've grown and learned. You're raised in a certain educational environment, society, and how we define what is scientific knowledge. I don't know that I would have really looked deeply at that at age 13. But as you move out into the world and you start interacting with different people and communities, living in the developing world, working with developing countries, and of course we have indigenous communities in developed countries, but recognizing we have a screwed up idea of what scientific knowledge is. It's like, don't even again, we get back to use of terms. They get you into sort of rigid boxes. It's the value in all sorts of different kinds of knowledge. And that we, as a society, often value one type of knowledge over another, or literally just don't see the value, or we let it disappear because we're not paying attention to the fact that actually matters, that knowledge matters. It not only matters culturally for the human beings we're talking about, it matters to us. It should matter to us globally, because we need that knowledge. We need to be able to share that knowledge. And that, it's, to me, not this is good knowledge, this is bad knowledge, this is valuable knowledge, this is not valuable. It's about all of it can have value. And actually, it's about the integration and what's the best way to integrate different forms of knowledge. And yeah, it's about also, it gets back to voices, like whose voices matter. I don't want to speak for a community. I want to figure out, especially, I mean, it's Seeds for All. A lot of what we've tried to do is to bring different communities from different countries together. So in a multilateral negotiation, there's some common ground. So that, and actually it doesn't have to be developing countries. I remember hosting a meeting, this was at the World Trade Organization, and we had small scale farmers from European countries and some from developing countries. And the European farmers were just shocked at the constraints that the World Trade Organizations had on small scale farmers in developing countries that they didn't have for them, because they grandfathered in the ability of these governments to subsidize small scale farmers in Norway or Switzerland. And that was not something that got grandfathered in for a developing country. And also developing countries wouldn't have the resources to do it. And meanwhile, they're facing trade rules like subsidies on American crops, which then get exported, and small scale farmers can't compete with the cheap food and crops that come in. And so they get displaced, their knowledge gets displaced. And then we've lost the resources, the knowledge, and the communities, their cultures and everything is eroded. It's about sort of seeing, again, the connections among these different communities and then trying to elevate their voices, not through me talking, let them speak. It's very fun when you're in a negotiation and you know, after you've had a group together, to hear them echoing one another in terms of what changes or support they want to see happen.
So we've mentioned Seeds for All a few times now, and you've talked a bit about what led you to starting this nonprofit. Just to give our listeners more context, could you share a bit more about what Seeds for All does as an organization?
Yeah. So we're a network of different people reaching out and working with small scale farming communities. And a lot of our work, Seeds for All partnered for about, I think, 4 or 5 years with Oxfam Novib. It's based in the Netherlands. Its project was called Sowing Diversity Equals Harvesting Security. So we worked with them for about 5 years in 7 different developing countries, working on both national policy, what's happening in these countries in terms of what is needed to support smallholder farmers that are working with agricultural diversity on farmers' fields, and also what's happening internationally that's influencing what is happening on the national ground. So Seeds for All spent a lot of time in partnership with Oxfam Novib in this particular program in bringing together small-scale farmers from different communities and also getting their voices heard in multilateral negotiations, but also bringing them together with national policymakers. So again, trying to elevate their voices, elevate awareness among policymakers, because I think things can often be overlooked. We don't know what we don't know. So a lot of it is that, trying to amplify voices that exist, and also trying to develop some, no pun intended, but cross-fertilization among farming communities, both within a country and amongst the countries that we were working with, in terms of what worked for you, because there are some very common interests, even in very diverse cultural and ecological situations. So yeah, so that's really what it's about. It's about finding interconnections and amplifying voices that matter, and hoping to have an impact on the policies that might either not support or could support the communities and the resources that they're conserving and developing.
And do you see like good change happening in terms of like integrating different knowledge systems and perspectives into policy?
Ooh, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that I think there is a much broader acceptance that there are different types of knowledge systems. And it's not just the quote unquote Western scientific model that has value or knowledge. So I think there is a much greater and broader acceptance and understanding of that. Where I worry is that I think there's still very powerful forces that push us another direction. And I think newer technologies, meaning higher technologies. I don't like using the word higher technologies, but sort of these quote unquote Western technologies, like digital information. And it's not that those technologies aren't important, or that the indigenous knowledge technologies are important. Again, I think it becomes about power and who owns the technologies. It boils down to sort of ownership issues. And so I guess that's where I worry about. So I think, yes, we have a much greater understanding that knowledge comes in lots of different forms. And there's there's tons of value in the different forms. And we need to find ways to respect and support different knowledge systems. So that, I think, is a big step forward. within countries and between countries, there's still such a strong power imbalance that I think often, and frankly, I think the commercial interests often are what override actually implementing this knowledge, that our understanding that knowledge systems come in lots of different forms, and that we should be doing something to make sure we don't erode the ones we're less familiar with in terms of our intergovernmental governance, that we recognize one kind of science for a long time. And now we've understood, oh, wow, knowledge and science, they come in all sorts of different forms from all different kinds of communities with all different kinds of cultures and resources. And I don't think we figured out how to do well about how we govern around that. I think we just need to infuse more equity into all of these things. And seeing why it's important to all of us that we do that. That our self-interest means we need to understand our interconnection. So even if you're only caring about your self-interest, figure out why this matters to understand the interconnections. I mean, I think they're ethical and moral and lots of reasons to do that. But even if you don't have those, this knowledge, these resources, these communities, they matter if you care about climate resilience. They matter if you want to feed all of us, even on the wealthier side within countries. We're going to need the resources and the knowledge. We're going to need to draw on all of it. And so anytime you say that isn't valuable, or I'm just going to let it go and let it erode the knowledge, the resources, that we're all at risk. I'm not sure that is understood as well as it should be understood in terms of actually creating the structures we need to do things differently, to address climate resilience, to address biodiversity loss. I think we have a ways to go.
This kind of circles back to what we were talking about with the wolves, and in terms of they're so dynamic, and it makes me think about the importance of innovative adaptive practices and how important that is for food security and biodiversity and climate change. Also relates back to like wildlife management and how, we're just so, we want to create these plans and have like a rigid structure, but we really need to acknowledge that it's an ever-changing environment with a variety, a diversity of perspectives and knowledge systems that need to be integrated. And so, could you talk a little bit about like the importance to this work of those adaptive practices?
I think that's actually such a good point, because when you look at small scale farmers, they tend to be the ones on the front line of climate change. They're on the front lines of it. So they're experimenting and innovating all the time. They have to. So they need, the genetic diversity. They need the support in terms of their knowledge systems and their communities in order to be able to continue to do that. And they need to do that for themselves in terms of being able to adapt. But again, they are absolutely producing what I call a global public good, because we also need those resources and those innovative practices. What they're doing right there on the front lines of climate change, and they're dealing with so much more diversity than you see being dealt with, say, from a seed bank in a lab, which doesn't mean what they're doing in seed banks and labs isn't important too. I think it's incredibly important, but we need to connect the two. We can't just focus on, we have all these seed banks, we're good. We can have plant breeders who are professional, do all we need to do, and we'll adapt to climate change. When the agrobiodiversity that's in farmers' fields so vastly overshadows what's in a seed bank. I think seed banks are really important, and international ones, national ones, particularly community seed banks. But the idea that is going to be our answer, as opposed to saying, and probably the primary thing we need to be doing is supporting agrobiodiversity in situ on farm and the farmers who are innovators. They're not clients of a seed bank. They're not clients of a company who's plant breeding for them. They are more than that. They should be more than equal. They should at least be equal partners in looking at how we do create the kind of systems that we can adapt to climate resilience wherever you are. But the innovators who are on the front lines of these changes and are dealing with environmental disturbances, drought, pests and disease, if we don't recognize their innovative capacity and what their conservation of these resources, their development of these resources, again, I think that is an absolutely necessary thing if we're going to have a resilient food system, because agrobiodiversity underpins that. And we have to start with what's existing in farmers' fields and support them. I would still completely be supporting seed banks from international down to community, because I also think that's important. And we have natural disasters where you want to be able to repatriate resources into communities. And you can't do that if they're gone. And we have more natural disasters. They're coming fast and furious. So again, these are complementary strategies. So again, it's against how do these things interconnect? Let's not pick one over the other. Let's see how they fit together and try to create a system of supports that works for us, whether it's at the local level or for us globally as a global community, which also includes wildlife.
Speaking of communities, wildlife, and the interconnectedness of this work, I want to ask you more broadly, what has working with humans and non-human animals like wolves taught you about yourself?
I think what I've learned about myself is how important it is to find commonalities among diversity. The diversity is really important. And it sounds trite, but it's sort of what we have in common is bigger than what makes us diverse. But we want to celebrate diversity, whether that's cultural diversity, and that could be cultural diversity in the animal kingdom, cultural diversity in the human kingdom. We want to celebrate those things and understand the importance of those things, but also see, again, what I would say is the common humanity, whether it's, again, with the animal kingdom, because I do think there's a common humanity because we have an evolutionary continuity, right, with the animal kingdom, but also our common humanity with people that we may not know or understand or speak the same language with, that we see those things and we value those things. And I think the importance of that, I think, is probably what I've learned from both working with human beings and with wildlife, that those are the things to look for. And I always think of sort of Darwin. I think he was the one that when he was writing, he said, if we have this evolutionary continuity, we have to recognize the possibility that animals have experiences that are similar to human beings. So that's a continuity. That's what I mean when I say common humanity with wildlife. It's like we have a lot in common. And to look for that amongst us as human beings and amongst us in terms of all life, that's the importance of that is just been reinforced from working with wolves to working in multilateral negotiations.
Yeah, I love that. Celebrating diversity, but really looking also for what connects us all. I think that's a great message. Yeah. And what advice, if you have any, would you give young women and girls as they're trying to figure out their career path?
I think it gets back to a lot of the qualities that we were discussing at the very beginning. And I would encourage anybody, stay curious. If you have a passion for it, follow it. But still stay curious about, what you're passionate about. Look for interconnections. Are there doorways that you didn't know existed that connect these two things? Do you want to cross through that doorway and get more engaged with that? Or do you want to figure out a way that you do work with it, even if you don't cross into the doorway, into something that looks like maybe a slightly different field or a very different field? And also don't give up. Don't give up. Because I do think, certainly for me as a woman working in the UN, it was tough. It was tough. It just was tough. There's existence sort of didn't exist anywhere. But I think in the United Nations, it can be a particularly difficult place for women at times. So yeah, I would encourage, don't give up if it seems tough. If you care about it and you're passionate about it, find people like Paul Packett and make an alliance with people like him and keep going. Keep going. If it matters to you, keep going.
Thank you so much, Susan, for joining us on the Of Wolves and Women series. It was so great to chat with you and learn from you, and thank you.
Well, thank you for having me, and I really appreciate your thoughts as well, and I really appreciate being invited.
Well, thank you all so much for listening. Tune in next time to hear more conversations about wolves and the inspiring women who study them. I want to acknowledge that this episode was hosted and recorded on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands.
This series is dedicated to Gudrun Pfluger, a passionate field biologist, friend, and source of inspiration to many within Raincoast and beyond. Raincoast Radio is hosted by Chelsea Greer and produced by me, Sophia Osborne, with additional audio editing by Omar Salafu. This podcast is a production of Raincoast Conservation Foundation, a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by research to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. Learn more and support our work at raincoast.org.